Most people, when they speak of childhood wounds, name what was done to them, the hand that struck, the voice that shouted, the door that slammed. These are wounds. They are visible, they have edges, the body knows where to find them, and the mind, given enough years, can describe them. But there is another kind of wound. It does not arrive, it does not happen. It is what failed to happen, and because nothing visible took place, the child who carries it spends 3 or 4 decades unable to name what was missing. This is wrong. The assumption that the deepest wound is the one that struck, the deepest wound is the one that never came close enough to strike. You recognize this. The body knew, before the mind had language for it, that something was supposed to be there and was not. The deepest childhood wound is not abuse, it is emotional absence. And what makes it the deepest is precisely this. It leaves no scar, it leaves a structure. Listen carefully here, because the distinction is not academic. A child who is struck knows they were struck. They may suppress it, they may dissociate from it, they may spend years in therapy circling it, but the event happened, and somewhere in the psyche there is a record, a moment. À place, à face, à sentence, the wound has coordinates. A child who was emotionally unmet has no coordinates. There was no event, there was only the temperature of the room, the mother who was physically present and psychologically elsewhere, the father who provided and did not see, the household where everyone functioned and no one was met. The child grew up in a house that, by all external measures, was fine. This is the difficulty Jung returned to in different language throughout the work on the parental complexes. He was less interested in what the parent did than in what the parent was psychically, archetypally, in the field of the child's developing psyche. A parent can do everything correctly and still not be present. The child registers presence. The child does not register correctness. I will return to this in a moment, but first I want to name something that you may already know. The child of emotional absence does not grow up thinking they were wounded. They grow up thinking they are the wound. There is a difference, and it is the entire architecture of the adult life that follows. A child who was struck can, in time, locate the perpetrator. The wound has a shape outside the self. There is someone to grieve, to rage at, to forgive or refuse to forgive. The wound is relational. It happened between two people, and the child can eventually retrieve themselves from it. A child of absence cannot do this. There is no perpetrator. The mother was present. The father did not leave. No one raised a hand. No one shouted. The wound has no external shape, so the child internalizes it. The wound becomes the self. The conclusion the child reaches silently, without language, before the age of 7, is not something is wrong with how I was met. It is something is wrong with me, that I needed more than what was given. Read that sentence again, slowly, because this is where the structure forms The child does not conclude that the parent was insufficient. The child concludes that they themselves are excessive. Their need is the problem. Their hunger is the flaw. Their reaching toward the parent and not being met is reframed by the child's own developing psyche as evidence of their own too muchness. And so the child does what every child does. When faced with absence they cannot leave. They reduce themselves, they become smaller, they become quieter, they become the version of themselves that does not require being met, because being met has been demonstrated to be unavailable. This is the moment the false self is born, not from cruelty, from accommodation. Jung described the persona as the mask that mediates between the individual and the collective. But there is an earlier persona, formed before the social one, the persona constructed for the parent, the face the child learned to wear so that the absent parent would not have to feel their own absence, the smile that asked for nothing, the competence that never burdened, the cheerfulness that arrived precisely when grief was building, because grief would have required someone to receive it. And there was no one. You may recognize the symptoms of this in yourself, though you would not have called them symptoms. You do not know what you want. You can describe what others want with terrifying accuracy. You can read a room before entering it. You can sense the emotional weather of a person within seconds. But asked what you yourself feel, you go blank, not because you feel nothing, but because the feeling never had a witness, and what is never witnessed in childhood does not develop the language to be felt. This is one of the most precise consequences of emotional absence. It is not that the adult does not feel, it is that feeling in them never developed the structure of speech. Their inner world is intact, but it is pre-verbal. They live as if everything important about them is happening just below the surface of language, and the surface itself remains polite, functional, available to others. The body, however, is less polite. The body keeps a different record. There was a man I knew in my work who came to me at 53. By every external measure, his life was successful, long marriage, children grown, work respected. He came not because something had happened, but because nothing was happening, and the nothingness had become unbearable. He could not name what he wanted. He could not name what he felt. He said, in our first session, I have been a good man. I just don't know if I have been a person. I asked him about his childhood. He said it was fine. His parents were good. He was not abused. He was not neglected. There was always food. School, attention to his grades. He paused. He said, I cannot remember a single time my mother asked me what I was thinking. That is the wound, not what was done, what was never asked. He told me a dream he had been having, off and on. For 30 years, he was in his childhood home. He walked through the rooms, the kitchen, the living room, to the hallway, and everything was as he remembered it. The furniture, the wallpaper, the smell, but the house was empty, not abandoned, empty in a different way, as if the people who lived there had stepped out for a moment and never returned. And yet the house had continued to function. The lamps were on, the kettle was warm, there was a place set at the table, but no one was there. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, in the dream, waiting for someone to come back. They never did, and what he remembered most when he woke was that in the dream he was not afraid, he was not even sad, he had simply understood, at some level deeper than thought, that this was how the house had always been. The emptiness was not an event, it was the architecture. This dream is precise, and it is precise in the way only the unconscious can be. The childhood home in the dream is not abandoned. That would be a wound of loss, of someone leaving. It is staged, set, prepared, functional, and unoccupied. This is what the home of emotional absence feels like. When the psyche finally renders it in image, everything was there, no one was home. I want to slow here, because there is a temptation, when describing this, to make it sound dramatic. It is not dramatic. That is its peculiar cruelty. A child of dramatic wounding has, at minimum, the dignity of having something to point to. A child of absence has nothing to point to, and so cannot grieve, and so cannot complete the wound, and so carries it forward into the adult life as a mood, a tendency, a vague sense that something foundational is missing and cannot be located. This vagueness is not yours. It was given to you. It is the inherited atmosphere of a house in which no one quite met anyone. And you are not going crazy for finding it hard to name. What I want you to understand, before we go further, is that the absence was real, even though it was invisible. The wound is real, even though it has no event. The years of small adjustments, your child self made the lowering of expectation, the abbreviating of need, the becoming easier to have. These were not character, they were adaptation. The personality you call yours, the one you have been living inside for 40 or 50 years, is in significant part a structure built around an absence that could not be named, and it is worth naming now what most people miss when they encounter this material for the first time. They want to convert it into a story of blame. They want to find the parent and indict them. This is understandable, and it is also a way of avoiding the deeper work, because the parent of emotional absence is almost always themselves a child of emotional absence. The wound is generational. The mother who could not meet you was not met. The father who provided and could not see was not seen. They were not withholding from cruelty. They were withholding from incapacity, and the incapacity was inherited. This is not exoneration. It is precision. To understand what happened, you have to see that what happened was a transmission, not a transgression. Something was passed down that no one in the chain knew how to interrupt. You may be the first one in your line who has even noticed it. That is not a small thing. It is also not a comforting thing, because the noticing itself is the beginning of a much longer and lonelier piece of work. The child of absence becomes, in adulthood, an exquisite reader of others and a stranger to themselves. They mistake this for empathy. It is not empathy in any complete sense. Empathy is a reciprocal capacity to feel what another feels, while remaining inside oneself. What the child of absence developed is something different. It is a one-way attunement, in which the self disappears, so the other can be perceived. This is not love. It is a survival skill that learned to call itself love because love was the word available. I will stop here for a moment. There is more, and we will return to it. 1:02 a.m. Claude responded. What I have just said about love deserves to be sat with, because it is the door through which the rest of this work has to pass. What I have just said about love deserves to be sat with, because it is the door through which the rest of this work has to pass. The child of emotional absence does not learn love. They learn attunement as survival, and they spend the rest of their life mistaking the second for the first. This is not a moral failing. It is what the psyche does when faced with a parent it cannot reach. The child develops a radar so fine, so quick, so precise, that the parent's mood becomes legible from across a room. The child knows when to approach and when to disappear. The child knows which version of themselves the parent can tolerate today and offers that version. The child becomes, before the age of 9, a small expert in another person's interior weather, and the cost of this expertise is the self, because the radar requires that the child evacuate their own interior in order to register the parents. There is not enough psychic space for both. The child's attention, which should have been turning inward to discover what they themselves feel, is turned outward, perpetually scanning. By the time the child becomes an adult, the scanning is automatic. They do it in every room they enter. They do it on every phone call. They do it in their marriage. They do it with their own children. And this is one of the quiet tragedies. The child of absence, having become a parent, scans their own child for signs of the child's mood and mistakes this scanning for presence. Presence is something else. Presence is the capacity to be in a room with another person without monitoring them. The child of absence, as an adult, often does not know what this feels like. They have never been on either side of it. I want to name a specific consequence of this, because it is one you may have lived without recognizing it. The adult who was emotionally unmet as a child has a particular relationship to relationships. They are drawn repeatedly to people who require the same skill the parent required. The unavailable partner, the depressed friend, the grandiose colleague, the lover whose mood determines the temperature of the room. Pop psychology will tell you this is repeating the pattern. That is true and also too small. What is happening is not merely repetition, it is competence seeking. The adult is unconsciously drawn to relational situations where their childhood skill is useful, because in those situations they know who they are. They are the one who reads. They are the one who adjusts. They are the one who manages the other's interior so that the relational temperature stays bearable. Take that competence away, and the adult of absence does not know what to do. Place them in a relationship with someone who is steady, present, available, who simply asks them what they want and waits for the answer and they panic. They will tell you the relationship feels boring. They will tell you there is no chemistry. What they will not say, because they cannot yet say it, is that without someone to monitor, they have no idea who they are. The structure of the self requires an other to scan, remove the other, and the self becomes vertiginous. This is not a flaw in their character. It is the specific shape of the wound, and it explains something that puzzles many people in this work, why, after years of insight, they keep choosing partners who confirm the original absence. They are not choosing the partner. They are choosing the conditions under which their childhood self knows how to function, or rather, more precisely, their childhood self chooses, and the adult self ratifies the choice, and then later, in the failure of the relationship, the adult self blames itself for not having chosen better, but the choice was never adult. The choice was made by the small child who learned that love is the work of reading another person carefully, and who cannot recognize as love anything that does not require this work. There is a question that arises naturally here, and I have heard it many times. The question is, what about the moments of warmth? What about the photograph of the parent holding me as a baby? What about the times my mother laughed with me? My father took me fishing. My grandmother made the cake on my birthday. Were those not real? Was none of it love? I want to answer this carefully, because the answer matters. It was real. It was also insufficient. Both are true. The child of emotional absence did not grow up in a vacuum. There were moments, there were even, sometimes, days. The parent was not a monster. The parent was a person with their own interior, occasionally available, often elsewhere. The child collected the moments of availability and built a private museum of them, and returned to that museum throughout childhood and adolescence as evidence that the love existed, that the parent was good, that the wound, if there was a wound, was the child's own fault for needing more than what was given. The museum is one of the most exquisite defenses the psyche has. It is not denial, it is curation. The child becomes the curator of the parent's best moments and sets aside everything else, not as repressed material, but as background, the texture of ordinary life, the temperature of the house, the long stretches between the curated moments when no one was home. Adults raised in absence, when they enter this material, often defend their parents fiercely at first. She did her best. He worked so hard. I have nothing to complain about. This is not lying. This is the museum speaking, and the museum is real. The moments were real. What is also real is everything that was not in the museum, and the work, when it begins, is not to dismantle the museum, but to enlarge the building, to allow into the structure of memory the unphotographed hours, the Tuesday afternoons, the dinners eaten in silence, the years of being looked at without being seen. Jung was, throughout the collected works, attentive to this kind of distinction between what the conscious mind preserves and what the psyche records below it. The conscious mind preserves the moments that confirm the story it can live with. The psyche records everything, and what the psyche records, if not made conscious, will direct the life. It will choose the partners, it will shape the career, it will build the home, it will repeat with extraordinary fidelity the conditions of the original absence, not because the psyche is cruel, but because the psyche is loyal. It is loyal to the unfinished. It returns again and again to what was never completed, hoping that this time, with this person, in this configuration, the absent parent will finally arrive. The absent parent does not arrive. The absent parent is not a person who can be retrieved by relational repetition. The absent parent is a structural condition. And the work of seeing this, really seeing it, not as an idea, but as a fact about your life, is the beginning of an interior shift that no relationship will provide and no insight will deliver in a single moment. I want to slow here, because something happens at this point in the work that is worth naming. When a person first sees the structure of emotional absence in their childhood, they do not feel relief. They feel a particular kind of grief that they were not prepared for. The grief is not for what was done. The grief is for what never happened. And grief for what never happened has no shape. There is no funeral for it. There is no event to mourn. The mother is still alive. Perhaps in the next town, the father is in a chair watching television. They are present. They were always present. The grief is not for their absence in the body. It is for their absence in the meeting that was supposed to occur and did not. 50 years ago, in a kitchen no one remembers. This grief is harder than the grief of loss. Because the object of grief is invisible, you cannot point to it. You cannot describe it to a friend who will recognize it. You can only say, I am grieving something that did not happen. And most people will hear this as poetic and not understand that it is a precise description of a real psychic event. The body, again, knows. The body, when this grief begins, will often produce symptoms that have no medical cause: fatigue without exertion, tears at no provocation, a heaviness in the chest that arrives in the late afternoon and lifts by morning, sleep that does not restore. These are not symptoms of pathology. They are the body finally being permitted to feel what was suspended at the age of 4. When the child decided that needing more was the problem and shut down the apparatus that registers being unmet. I will stop on this point because I want to be careful with it. The fatigue is not depression in the clinical sense, though it can be confused with it. Depression flattens the world. This grief sharpens it. You see the absence everywhere. Now in your own home, in the way your spouse looks past you, in your colleague's distracted nod, in the friend who asks how you are without waiting for the answer. You see it because the radar is now turned for the first time on the truth of your situation rather than on managing the people around you. The world, when this seeing begins, becomes unbearably populated by absences, not because the world has changed, because you have stopped curating, and then a strange thing begins to happen, and I want to describe it because it is the next phase, and people often do not know they are entering it. After the grief comes a quiet. The grief does not resolve, it does not heal. It simply, at some point, gets quieter. The crying stops without anyone telling it to. The fatigue lifts in increments. The world is still populated by absences, but the absences no longer surprise you. You have stopped expecting people to be present in the way you needed your parents to be present and were not. This sounds like progress. It is, and it is also where the most disorienting part of the work begins, because the structure of your personality, the architecture you built around the original absence, was held together by the unconscious hope that someone, somewhere, would eventually meet you, take away the hope, and the structure begins to come apart, not dramatically, quietly. The relationships that ran on your scanning begin to feel inert. The friendships that required your competence begin to feel one-sided. The work that you organized around being indispensable begins to feel pointless. Nothing is wrong. Exactly, everything has lost its grip. This is not breakdown. This is the dissolution of a self that was constructed for an absent parent. In the absence of the parent for whom it was constructed, the structure no longer needed, no longer holds. And what comes next? The new structure, the self that is built not in response to absence, but on its own ground, does not arrive immediately. It does not arrive on a schedule. There is a long stretch in between, and the stretch is its own phase, and the phase has a name in older traditions, but not yet a name in your own life. You may be inside this stretch already and not have known it had a shape. For now, what I want you to hold is the precision of what we have named. The wound was not what was done. The wound was the meeting that did not occur. The personality you built was a structure for a parent who could not be reached. The grief, when it begins, is for what never happened. And the dissolution that follows the grief is not failure. It is the slow undoing of an architecture that no longer serves you. In a house, you are only now realizing was never quite occupied. The kitchen, in the dream, is the inheritance. The empty room with the lamps still on, the table set for someone who never came home. You have been the one in the kitchen all this time, waiting, and the waiting, which has been so quiet you mistook it for your personality, is what is finally beginning to end. The dissolution has a shape. Even if no one has described it to you, it does not feel like a stage. It feels like something has gone wrong with your life. The relationships that worked do not work. The ambitions that drove you do not drive you. The version of yourself you have been performing for 30 or 40 years is still available to be performed, and you can still perform it on demand. But you notice now, for the first time, that the performance is happening. There is a small distance between you and the role. The distance is uncomfortable. The distance is also the entire point. What is happening is not that you are losing yourself. What is happening is that the self that was built around the original absence is becoming visible to you as a construction. And once a construction becomes visible as a construction, it cannot fully reassemble. You can return to the role, you can play it well, but you can no longer believe in it the way you believed in it last year, when it was simply who you were. Jung described something in this register, in his work on the persona, that is worth holding here. He observed that the persona becomes pathological not when it exists. Everyone has one. Everyone needs one. The social world requires it. But when the individual identifies with it so completely that they do not know they are wearing it. The crisis comes not when the persona fails. The crisis comes when the identification with the persona breaks. And what breaks the identification is, almost always, an interior event the person did not choose and cannot reverse. For the child of emotional absence, the persona was unusually load-bearing. It was not just a social mask. It was the structure that allowed the child to remain in proximity to a parent who could not meet them. The persona managed the parent's mood. The persona offered the parent the version of the child the parent could tolerate. The persona was, in effect, the relationship, because the child between the persona and the parent was not received, and only the persona was. The child therefore moved, by the age of 7 or 8, fully inside the persona, and the persona became indistinguishable from the self. When this persona begins to break in midlife, the experience is far more disorienting than the breaking of an ordinary persona, because what is breaking is not a mask the person wore over a self. What is breaking is the self itself, or rather, what the person had been calling the self, which turns out, on closer inspection, to have been a sustained accommodation to an absence that was never named. You may have been told, when you began to feel this, that you were having a midlife crisis. That language is not entirely wrong, but it is unhelpfully shallow. A crisis implies an event that disturbs an otherwise stable structure. What is happening here is the opposite. The structure was never stable. The structure was a long compensation. What is happening now is not a disturbance of the structure, but the slow, late, inevitable recognition of what the structure was always doing. I want to name a specific feature of this phase because it is one that often goes unrecognized and therefore unhonored. People in this phase frequently say of themselves, "I do not know who I am anymore." They say this with distress. They say it as a problem to be solved. They want, often urgently, to know who they are again, and they look for the answer in books, in course, in retreats, in relationships, in new careers. They look outward, because outward is where they have always looked, and outward is where the radar was trained to find the answer. But the answer is not outward. The answer is also not immediately inward, because the inward, at this stage, is not yet populated. The interior of a person who spent 40 years scanning others is not full of self-knowledge waiting to be discovered. It is, in many places, empty, not empty in a dramatic sense, empty in the sense of having never been inhabited. The rooms exist, they are simply unfurnished, because the attention that should have furnished them was always being spent elsewhere. This is one of the more difficult truths in this work. When you finally turn the radar inward and ask what you yourself feel, what you yourself want, what you yourself believe, you will not always find an answer. You will sometimes find a silence, and the silence is not failure. The silence is accurate. There was no one home to develop preferences. The preferences will form in time, but they form slowly, in conditions of unaccustomed quiet, and they cannot be hurried. This is where many people at this stage make a particular error. They mistake the silence for nothing, and they go looking for content to fill it. They take up new identities, they pick up causes, they become, at 50, someone with new hobbies and new opinions and new relationships. And they call this transformation. Sometimes it is, often it is the old radar, redirected, the same competence, the same scanning, the same shaping of the self for legibility only. Now the audience is different. The mechanism is intact, only the costume has changed. The deeper movement is harder because it requires staying with the silence long enough for something genuine to arise from it, rather than importing content from outside to cover it. The deeper movement requires a kind of patience. The child of absence was never given the experience of they were not waited for. No one held silence with them long enough for their interior to surface. They learned to surface their interior only when it had already been pre-shaped to be acceptable. The raw, unformed interior, the interior that does not yet know what it thinks, was never met by anyone. And so the adult does not know how to meet it in themselves. There is a quality of attention that this requires, which has no good name in modern language. It is not introspection in the usual sense. Introspection presumes there is something to inspect. What is required here is closer to a kind of fallow attention, the attention you might give to a field that has been overworked, knowing that nothing will grow in it for some time, and that the not growing is itself part of the recovery. You stop demanding that your interior produce, you stop interrogating it, you let it lie. This is unbearably uncomfortable for the child of absence, because their entire identity was built on production. They produced the mood the parent needed. They produced the achievements the parent could be proud of. They produced the adult self that managed the world without burdening anyone. To stop producing even internally, even in private, is to encounter the original conditions that the production was designed to escape. The fallow interior, when you finally permit it, returns you to the kitchen of the dream. The lamps are on, the table is set, no one is coming home, and you, standing in the room, have to decide whether to keep waiting or whether to begin very slowly to occupy the house yourself. This decision is not a decision in the ordinary sense. It is not a single moment. It is 1,000 small refusals, refusals to scan, refusals to perform, refusals to be the version of yourself that was constructed for someone who is not arriving. Each refusal is uncomfortable. Each refusal feels, in the moment, like a kind of loss, You are losing the relationships that ran on your scanning. You are losing the identity that ran on your performance. You are losing the future you imagined, which was, on closer inspection, a continuation of the past disguised as progress. What you are losing is the architecture of accommodation. What you are gaining, in the gaps the architecture leaves behind, is the slow appearance of something that was never permitted to form. There is a self that you would have been if the parent had met you. That self does not now exist, it cannot be retrieved, because the conditions for its formation are 40 years behind you, but something can form on the other side of recognizing the original absence. It is not the self you would have been, it is a different self, formed in the conditions of having seen what was missing, and built on the ground of that seeing. This is, in some sense, the meaning of individuation in the late life of someone who began under conditions of absence. The early life work of individuation, in Jung's framing, is the differentiation of the ego from the unconscious and from the parental complexes. For the child of absence, there is an additional layer before the ego can differentiate from the parental complex. The parental complex itself has to become visible, and it is unusually difficult to make visible, because it does not consist of a parent who was present and overbearing. It consists of a parent who was absent in a way that left no marks. The complex is, in this case, a complex around a hollow, and the hollow has to be felt as a hollow before the ego can stop organizing itself around the hollow's invisible gravity. This is why this work is so often delayed until midlife or later, not because people are slow or unwilling or undeveloped, because the wound itself is structurally hidden. It takes decades for a person to gather enough evidence: failed relationships, repeated patterns, exhaustion that has no cause, a general sense of having lived a competent life that was somehow not their own, to begin to suspect that the foundational story of their childhood was not the story they were told. They were told they had a normal upbringing. They were told they were lucky, given what other people endured. They were told, often by their own parents, that they were loved, and they were loved in the way the parents knew how to love, which was not enough, and could not be admitted to be not enough without fracturing the entire family narrative. The fracture, when it comes, does not need to be public. You do not need to confront the parent. You do not need to write the letter. Hold the conversation. Name the wound aloud. The work is interior. The fracture is interior. What ends when this work proceeds is not the relationship with the parent that may continue, in whatever form it has. For as long as the parent lives, what ends is the unconscious agreement to maintain the family story at the cost of your own seeing. The agreement was made by a child who had no power to refuse it. The agreement is yours to revoke, and the revocation does not require permission. It requires only that you stop pretending inside yourself not to know what you have always known. The mother was present and not there. The father provided and did not see. The home was functional and unoccupied. You waited in the kitchen for someone who was already gone, and the waiting became your personality, and the personality became your life, and the life has now begun quietly to dissolve. The dissolution is not a failure of the life. The dissolution is the recognition that the life was built on a weight that had to end, and the ending of the weight is not a triumph. It is a quiet relinquishing of a hope that organized everything. You will not be met by your parent. You will not be retrieved by anyone in the way the child needed retrieving. The parent who could have met you is not available, was never available in the original sense, and is certainly not available now. 50 years later, in whatever form the parent takes today, but something else becomes possible in the absence of that hope that was not possible while the hope was still operating. You become slowly available to yourself, not as a project, not as a performance, as a presence. You become someone who can be in the room with yourself without scanning. You become someone who can sit with your own interior without demanding that it produce. You become someone for whom the kitchen of the dream is no longer a place of waiting, because you have stopped expecting anyone to come back, and the room is, for the first time, simply yours. This is not arrival. This is not healing in any complete sense. This is the beginning of a different kind of inhabitation. On the other side of a weight that lasted most of your life, there is more to say about what comes next, and what does not, and why the loneliness of this phase is unlike any loneliness that came before it. The loneliness, when it begins, is not the loneliness you knew before. The loneliness you knew before was relational. It was the loneliness of being in the room with people who did not see you. It was the loneliness of phone calls that did not return, of friendships that ran on your scanning, of marriages in which two people lived parallel and never quite intersecting lives. That loneliness was painful, but it had a shape. It pointed outward. It said, "There is no one here who meets me," and the implicit hope inside it was someone eventually might. This new loneliness has a different structure. It does not point outward. It does not carry the hope that someone is coming. It is the loneliness that arrives once you have stopped waiting, and what you discover in the stopping is that the waiting itself was a form of company. The waiting populated the kitchen. The waiting was a presence, the presence of a hope, however quiet, that the absent parent would arrive in some form, in some other person, at some later moment. When the waiting ends, the kitchen is, for the first time, actually empty, and the actual emptiness is different from the imagined emptiness. The imagined emptiness has someone almost in it. The actual emptiness has no one. This is the phase no one warned you about. The early literature on healing is full of beginnings, the first recognition, the first grief, the first refusal to perform. The literature thins as it goes, and by the time you reach the territory we are in now, there is almost nothing written, because almost no one stays in this territory long enough to describe it. Most people at this point recoil. They cannot tolerate the actual emptiness. They reach back into the old structures, a new relationship that runs on the old scanning, a new project that runs on the old production, a new identity that runs on the old performance, and they call this recovery. It is not recovery, it is the structure rebuilding itself, slightly disguised, in territory that briefly belonged to something else, to stay in the actual emptiness, even for a season, is to encounter something Jung wrote about in his work on the later phases of individuation, in language he was careful with because he knew the territory was easily misread. He described an interior phase in which the old structures of the personality have dissolved and the new structures have not yet formed. And he warned that this phase is unusually dangerous, not because the person is at risk in the obvious sense, but because the temptation to flee back into the old structures is enormous, and the temptation has the appearance of health. It looks like getting better, it looks like moving on. It is, in fact, the closing off of the interior space in which the new self could form. What is forming in this phase forms slowly, and it forms only if it is not interrupted. The fallow attention I named in the previous part is the condition for it. The interior, given enough silence, begins to produce not on demand, not on schedule, but in small, unbidden movements. A preference appears that you did not construct, a reaction arises that was not calibrated for anyone else. A small refusal occurs that no one asked for. These movements are easy to miss because they do not announce themselves. They have the quality of weather rather than event. But if you are paying the right kind of attention, you begin to notice that something inside you is starting to have a position of its own, independent of the audience. This is the beginning of a self that was not constructed for the absent parent. It is not retrieval, there is no original self underneath, waiting to be uncovered. The mythology of recovering the true self is, in this case, misleading. There is no true self underneath the false self. There is the false self formed by accommodation, and there is the slow possibility of a different self forming on the ground of having seen the accommodation. What you are forming was not there before. What you are forming requires the recognition of the original absence as its precondition. I want to describe a dream that came to me in my work from a woman of 58 who had been in this phase for nearly 2 years. She had stopped scanning. She had ended the relationships that ran on her competence. She had grown quieter than she had ever been, and the quiet had stopped being painful. Though it had not yet become anything else, she came to me with this dream, and she said it was the first dream in many years that she could not interpret with the old language. She was in a room she did not recognize. The room was large, and it had no furniture. The walls were the color of bone. There was a single window, and through the window she could see a landscape that was neither day nor night, a kind of long, even light, the way the sky looks for a few minutes after sunset, before the dark fully arrives. She was alone in the room, and she understood in the dream that the room was hers, not given to her, not assigned. Hers in some older sense, the room had been hers always, and she was only now entering it. She walked the perimeter of the room. She placed her hand against one of the walls. The wall was warm, as if the house had been heated by someone who had left just before she arrived. She stood in the center of the room for a long time. She was not sad. She was not happy. She was, for the first time in her life, in a room she did not have to manage. There was no one to read. There was no mood to adjust. There was no audience. The room asked nothing of her, and she understood in the dream that this was what had been waiting on the other side of the kitchen. She woke and she said, when she described the dream, that she had cried not from grief, not from joy, but from a kind of recognition that she did not have a word for. She had spent her whole life in the kitchen of the original house, and she had not known that there was another room somewhere else in the same architecture that had been hers all along, and that no one had ever entered, because no one had ever been invited, because she herself had not known it was there. The bone-colored room is the interior that begins to become available in this phase. It is not full, it is not decorated, it is not yet a self in the sense that the old self was a self. It is instead a kind of unfurnished space that is recognizably yours in a way that nothing in your life has been recognizably yours before. And the slow work of the rest of your life on the other side of the kitchen is to inhabit this room, not to fill it quickly, not to import furniture from the old house, to stay in it long enough that what enters it on its own terms and belongs. This is what individuation looks like for the child of emotional absence in late life. It does not look like wholeness in the way the literature sometimes promises. It looks like an unfurnished room that is finally yours, and a wait that has finally ended, and a kind of company that no longer requires anyone else to be in the room. I want to be careful here, because there is a temptation to describe this as a kind of triumph, and it is not a triumph, it is a quieter event, the hope that the parent would arrive, which organized the entire life, has been relinquished. The relinquishing is real. It is also irreversible. You cannot unsee what you have seen. You cannot return to the kitchen and resume the wait, because the wait has ended, and the ending of the wait was not a choice you made on a particular day. It was the slow arrival of a recognition that, once arrived, cannot be sent back. What this means, practically, is that the relationships in your life from this point forward will have a different quality. The people who could only meet your scanning will fall away, not because you have rejected them, but because the scanning is no longer available to be met by. The people who can meet you in the bone-colored room are different people, fewer in number, and you may not have known them yet. Some of them will arrive, some of them will not. The room does not require them. The room is sufficient on its own, in a way that the kitchen never was. There is a sentence I want to say carefully, because it carries the weight of this whole arc. What has been named here is what you have been living. The naming did not invent the wound. The wound was always there, beneath the language you had for your life, beneath the museum of curated moments, beneath the architecture of accommodation. The naming did not heal the wound, in the sense that healing implies the wound goes away. The wound is structural, and the structure does not vanish. What the naming did was end your participation in the unconscious agreement to pretend the wound was not there. And the ending of that agreement is the ending of the weight, and the ending of the weight is the entering of the room that was always yours and was always empty, and is now, for the first time, occupied by you. The final thing I want to say in this lecture concerns what does not happen next. You will not, on the other side of this work, become someone who is no longer affected by the original absence. The body will still register in certain rooms the old temperature. The radar will still flicker in moments of stress into its scanning posture. The competence will still be available, and you may still use it. In the situations where it is appropriate, the wound is not erased, the structure is not undone. What is different is that you now know what these movements are. You can see the radar when it activates. You can see the competence when it offers itself. You can see the scanning, and you can choose in any given moment whether to follow it or to remain in the room. The choosing is the work from this point forward. The work does not end. The work simply becomes the texture of the life, a sustained attention to what is yours and what was given to you, what is forming and what is repeating, what belongs in the new room and what was furniture from the old house that you do not need to keep. The kitchen is still there. The lamps are still on. The table is still set. But you are no longer the one in the kitchen. You have left that room, not by leaving the house, but by entering a room in the same house that no one ever told you was there. The waiting has ended. The kitchen will not be returned to.
This has been Carl Jung Original, a space where the patterns most people live through can finally be named. Voice and imagery, AI-assisted interpretation and framing, original work. Until next lecture.